Go right ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today, we will be talking about tools for tackling corporate landlords. For technical help during today's webcast, just type those questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer those. For questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation during the designated Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2024. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free. Today's guest host is the APA Planning and the Black Community Division. Thank you for joining us this year and for bringing the session to us. And you'll hear a little bit more about them from Tia in just a moment. Upcoming webcasts, we have 3 left this year. Tomorrow, ethics, next Friday, law, and then the Friday after that, we have our final New Year, New You, New Staff report. I'm personally looking forward to all 3 of these sessions along with today's session. So you can register for all of these by heading over to our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Believe it or not, I probably have 10 to 12 sessions already booked for 2025, and we're going to be loading those up. We're starting strong in January and February, so be sure to check back often so that you can register for our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. You can log your CM credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a reminder of what's on tap. We record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So head over to YouTube and just type in Planning Webcast. We'll pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So that's the end of my housekeeping. And I have to introduce you before I move it over to you, Tia. Paula Fries is the Executive Director of the Illinois chapter of APA, and she will be so thankfully facilitating, moderating the Q&A portion because I double booked myself. So she will be here to help facilitate that Q&A at the end. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Tia, to kind of talk about the Planning in the Black Community Division and tee things up.
Thank you so much. So I'm Tia Kidd. I'm the current chair of PBCD, or Planning in the Black Community Division. Next year, we'll be celebrating 45 years of being in existence, or being a division with APA. So that's pretty exciting. We have just over 700 members, and half of them, or just less than half, are about students. And so I'm glad to be a part of this planning webcast series. I'm glad that Matt decided to join us today. And I really I think that's it. I mean, there's always more to share, but at the least. So thank you, Christine. And I want to introduce Matt, and she'll tell us everything we need to know, even where she works. So thanks, Matt.
All right, is everyone able to see my screen okay?
Here we go. Looks good.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, just give me 1 second to get oriented here. Pardon me, y'all. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Madeline, or Mad Bankson. I am the senior housing researcher at the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. I use they, them pronouns, and I am based for right now in Durham, North Carolina. I'll soon be relocating to Virginia, but I've lived in North Carolina for a long time. So I bring that context to this presentation. I think that's important. The other context I bring is that I have a master's in city and regional planning. Obviously, I do not work as a practicing planner, but I'm really interested in the sort of complexities of land use planning, and I'm excited to talk to some people who understand that today. So just a little bit about my organization. Our name is a mouthful, but we go by PSP for short. PSP is a nonprofit watchdog organization that seeks to uplift those who are mobilizing against private equity's negative impacts on people and the planet. We produce research, we engage with investors, and we help tenants in their campaigns, amongst a kind of a host of other things. Um, we have several issue areas in addition to housing, so we're also working on labor, climate and environment, detention and surveillance, as well as healthcare. And just to get started with this presentation, this photo is one of our partner orgs that we worked with heavily last year, Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or Renters United for Justice, out of Minnesota. And this is some of their work that they were doing to campaign against private equity. Here we go. Just to get into our presentation flow here, first I'm going to spend some time talking about just what private equity is and how it functions. Then I'll move into talking about specifically how that shows up in the housing space. Then I'll talk for a brief moment about how planning and local governance sometimes enables private equity. And then finally, we'll end spending a lot of time on what policy interventions are possible to kind of mitigate some of these harms. So before we get too into what private equity is and how it operates, I kind of just want to chart out this ecosystem a little bit so that folks know what sorts of landlords we are talking about here today. If you've heard about the issue of mega housing investors, you've probably heard the terms maybe real estate investors, institutional investors, private equity, corporate landlords, hedge funds, and maybe even real estate speculators thrown around kind of more or less interchangeably. And while these things all very much do exist in the same ecosystem and at times have a lot of overlap, they're kind of spongy categories sometimes. Private equity is going to be a specific term that does not describe all corporate landlords. But let's talk about what we mean when we say corporate landlords. So technically, a corporate landlord, it just really refers to a legal structure. It's a landlord that uses a limited liability corporation as the legal entity that holds their properties. So in that case, even a smaller or so-called mom and pop landlord can technically be corporate. My former landlord just owned one home, but I paid my rent to her LLC. That being said, when most people, including me, are using the term corporate landlords, we basically mean a big company. We're referring to a large company that may use algorithms or other technologies to manage their portfolios. They typically operate across multiple states, have access to large amounts of capital, and have a lot of employees. So REITs, real estate investment trusts, or REITs, private real estate investment companies that are not REITs or private equity, some hedge funds, and private equity would all be considered corporate landlords. I'm not going to get into the differences beyond that because it gets really confusing really quickly. And something about this topic is like, there's a lot of intense terminology already that I have in the slide deck. So the main thing to just know is that all private equity landlords are corporate landlords, but not all corporate landlords are necessarily private equity. In practice, private equity and other corporate landlords are going to function pretty similarly a lot of the time, and we'll talk about how that is. But there are a few key differences that make private equity, let's say, special. All right, so now I'm going to run through what private equity is and some of the basics of how it works. And I'm going to cover a lot of detail in a short time. If you're not familiar with this world and its vocabulary, it's going to seem overwhelming, but don't worry, I have that link at the bottom. That's our resource page with all this information that's actually designed for tenants, so it's really accessible. So what is private equity? Finally, let's get into it. It doesn't just mean mega Wall Street corporations with bad intentions, right? Private equity is a very specific business structure, what is often called a private asset manager. So what that means is they are soliciting money from public pension fund systems, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, endowments, and other really large investors like that. So as government employees or maybe nonprofit workers, you and I probably can't invest in private equity. I mean, unless, you have a pension, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it's usually reserved for really high net worth individuals and the above entities, which are what we call institutional investors. When private equity is fundraising, it pools money into big pots that we're going to call funds to buy either a company or, in the case of housing, a real estate property or a portfolio of properties. Um, so the way that they do this, and it's pretty complicated, but they use what they call leverage, which is really just a fancy word for debt. So the goal is once they've kind of got stuff loaded up with debt, they want to make the company more profitable so that investors can sell for a higher price and then pay back all of that debt. Um, so where does profit come from? How do you make a company more profitable? Pretty much the formula that we say when we talk to press and lawmakers is raise revenue, cut costs. It's really pretty straightforward. Um, Often that means you're going to be stripping a company just down to its parts. And this is often called restructuring. So in some cases, even when the business fails, private equity will still make a lot of money from selling off a company's various assets. And the example that I'll use to talk about this is Red Lobster, which you may have heard about. I think there was some kind of joking stuff going around that was like, oh, people ate too many shrimp, and they did lose some money on shrimp, but that's not really what happened. Basically, the private equity firm that bought Red Lobster used a bunch of leverage to do so, and then sold the real estate of the restaurants, and then used that money from the real estate to pay off the debt that they took out to buy the company. They then leased the buildings back to the company, sometimes at above market rates. So when Red Lobster couldn't make enough money to pay off those really high rents, they declared bankruptcy and thousands of people lost their jobs. A really similar thing right now is happening with hospitals. It happens all the time. You may have heard of Stewart Healthcare. That's an example that's been in the news a lot lately. So pardon my digression. What's important to note here is that whether or not private equity gets paid is not contingent on the quality of services they provide. Or in the case of housing, it's not even really contingent on tenants having a positive experience or even safe or stable housing. It's really about generating that as much profit as possible on a timeline that's as quick as possible. It throws into a lot of questions. It throws into questions a lot of things that we know and hold true about markets and how they work. So some other things to note about private equity is that it's very present in every sector of the economy. So you heard me earlier mention all the issue areas in which PSP works. And it's everything from oil and gas to veterinary practices to consumer goods like Payless and Tupperware, even to like agriculture. Many companies that you would recognize are owned by private equity, and it's hard to know that if you're just a regular person. Private equity also is run by the mega wealthy. They make money through management fees that are paid out by their investors, which includes your public pension fund, among other things. This is really important to know about private equity, is that it's poorly regulated and extremely opaque. So whereas publicly traded entities, we know a little more about what's going on because they have reporting requirements, we actually have no idea about a lot of what's going on behind the scenes with private equity. And this is kind of my job, right, is to put all of these pieces together. One thing about corporate landlords that's really specific and private equity is that they're also kind of adding to that opacity by using what we call limited liability corporations. You're probably familiar with this, but they're just trying to essentially put a degree of separation between their larger business and whatever kind of entity is owning the properties. So not only is it hard to know who is doing that owning, they also have like a degree of kind of legal insulation in the event that they get sued. So that sounds pretty bad. Like why are we doing this? Well, so private equity is really appealing to investors because they're advertising pretty high returns. It's often like in the 15 to 20% range is what they'll tell people. That's about 2 to 3 times as much as other asset classes that these large institutional investors are going to be invested in. Obviously, that comes with a lot of risk, but it's really attractive to pension staff who have a legal fiduciary duty to grow their workers' retirement accounts, right? So they see those big returns and they're like, great, we're helping our workers. But the flip side of this is that, like I said, it is really risky, especially in uncertain economic environments, and it comes with a really high potential to lose money because there is so much legal and also regulatory risk. Housing in particular is a really popular investment choice for private equity because it's seen as relatively low risk, given that people always need somewhere to live. I think we're in a space where things are shaky enough that maybe that's less true than it has felt for the past few years. But in general, that's what we're going for here. So just quickly, I am gonna talk about what that process that I just outlined is just again, just because it's kind of complicated. So the first step of the process is private equity firms are working to find investors, which are also called limited partners. Those are your pension funds, etc. And they then create specific investment funds, those pots of money, bringing together all of that money from limited partners. And they'll do that fundraising every couple of years, often coming back to the same investors over and over. The private equity firms using that money then take controlling stakes or buy outright portfolio companies or properties, depending on kind of which one you're looking at, housing or sort of other types of companies. Private equity firms will also change processes within their portfolio companies once they own them to make them more profitable. And this operates a very specific way in real estate that I'll talk about in a minute. And then once these changes have been made, private equity firms will sell the portfolio companies for a profit. If the profit is made, a portion of it is then returned to limited partners. And there's a little bit of specificity with that around housing. Real estate operates a little differently than everything else, but pretty much this is all going to be true. And again, if you want to see this resource, it is on our website under Private Equity 101. All right. So private equity and housing, where does this come from? This really, private equity really arose like in the 80s with some of the liberalization that came with Reagan. We saw their incursion into the real estate space really begin after the 2007, 2008 recession in the United States and global recession. So what happened was there was this glut of housing that was now available and they purchased it very cheaply. In some cases, it's some of the same guys that led to the recession then went in and started companies that were buying up large numbers of houses that they were either renting or reselling. Um, we then subsequently saw a really big buying spree that began at the onset of the pandemic, and continued through kind of the beginning of 2022. This has slowed because of rising interest rates. Like I said, private equity is using a lot of debt, so that gets really expensive, but it's still going strong. They're continuing to expand and consolidate, to a degree that's pretty frightening, especially in the states where they're most active. We still are seeing rates like where it's really escalating very quickly. So it's like I said, we have a lot of issues with transparency here. It's really hard to know what private equity owns. Americans for Financial Reform, which is a great partner organization of ours, conducted an analysis in 2020 that found that private equity owned about 2 million units nationally. They at the time even acknowledged this was an undercount, and this was before that major spree of acquisition in the beginning of COVID that we saw. Um, so it could be double that. Like nobody really knows. It's hard to say. And it involves really just going through what we typically do is just go through parcel data and tie these LLCs together using their addresses. So it's very labor intensive. Usually a private equity firm, like I said, owns a company that's like connected to an LLC that owns properties, and it's a really messy web. So that's just hard to know. We do think that they own about 1.2 million apartment units and hundreds of thousands of manufactured housing lots. Single family rentals, it's hard to say, but several. One thing that's really, really important to note, and I'll talk more about this when we get to our myth busting section, is that it's not evenly distributed. So private equity is concentrating very specifically in certain states, within those states, within certain cities and regions, and then even within those cities, specific neighborhoods. And that has quite an impact on those places. I live in Durham, North Carolina, which is like North Carolina has really seen a lot of this investment and it has been very disruptive to our local housing system. Private equity also is involved in every type of housing and they're constantly searching for new markets. So we see they have a heavy presence in the single family rental space. That's what's gotten a lot of press, but it's really not the only place where they're present. They're also present in the multifamily space. and continuing to expand there. They also are increasingly getting into affordable and subsidized housing. And especially lately, the trend has been more towards manufactured housing and student housing, as well as several newer business models like build to rent, rent to own, and short-term rentals. They are expanding in all of those areas. So if there's a type of housing, private equity is probably trying to figure out how to make money off of it. So why is this bad? Um, I mean, as people aware of housing issues, I mean, I think you probably know also that so-called mom and pop landlords can also be really problematic. I do not want to minimize that. We believe at PSP that private equity landlords are particularly important to pay attention to, essentially because they're seeking really high returns on such a short timeline. And that's going to be more or less profit seeking above pretty much every other priority. Um, and that's like a very short-term profit seeking, right? So the goal of private equity landlords, usually, not always, they do vary a little bit in their individual business strategy, is going to be to flip a real asset within 3 to 7 years for multifamily. Single family homes, they'll sometimes hold on to in relative perpetuity to continue extracting rent. And then for all housing types, again, they are advertising those returns to their investors of 15 to 20%. Um, and again, we're returning to our formula, right? Increase revenue, minimize costs. Um, so as you can imagine, when you're really like prioritizing profit at everything else, that leads to really bad tenant outcomes. So there's some key ways that they're going to be raising revenue. Um, the biggest one is that they come in and they very quickly increase rents, and will seek as much rent as is really possible for their market area. I mean, I think most landlords do that, but private equity is really pushing it in a unique kind of way. They also will add a lot of ancillary fees and fines. Um, so that's going to be everything from you're paying a trash fine now or trash fee now to you get a fine because you left something outside to you'll get a fake fine because you supposedly paid your rent late even if you didn't, to now you have to pay pet rent. It's like it really runs the gamut of things. And it's even things like um people will be responsible for HOA fees or like sewer things that tenants just typically don't pay for. And so that actually can add hundreds of dollars to the sticker price of the rent. And a lot of people who don't have the literacy to really like read through their lease really well or just don't know that they need to do that end up in like pretty bad financial situations because of this. And then once the rent is more expensive, they come in and evict people. There are a few different reasons this happens. Some of it is just to like clear out and re-rent those units at the new higher rate. Um, some of it also is trying to get people to rack up fees on their account. So they have to pay more money. They'll like serve people with kind of spurious evictions. They also are gonna be cutting their costs. So that's how they get all the money. How are they sort of cutting those costs? Um, the really big one is they're deferring their maintenance. So just basically not really doing much to fix up the homes. Um, and in addition to that, reducing a lot of personnel and automating management. So what that comes out to is stories where tenants will have a major issue and they just can't ever get the company to respond, if there even is anybody to respond. It's just, it leads people to be in a lot of really dire situations. And I'll show you in a second a couple of cases from people that I've heard about. The other reason private equity landlords are going to be really worth paying attention to is just they have this really widespread reach. So many of them have portfolios that will span the entire country or at least like many states across the country. Often they're going to concentrate again in certain markets. Some of them do try to benefit from those kind of economies of scale. Um, so they'll often use algorithms to locate their properties and they tend to buy up large portions of submarkets in certain cities. Um, Ownership rates are also especially concentrated, like I said, in specific cities and neighborhoods. So that's going to be places like all the cities are going in Texas, Florida, North Carolina, the Atlanta area, amongst other places. But It's really been like they're looking for areas that have what they deem a high degree of economic growth. And this matters a lot for the people who live in those places and those neighborhoods. Like they are really at risk of displacement and landlord abuse. Um, and finally, I'm just going to mention this briefly because it's an entire huge can of worms, but corporate landlords and private equity landlords in particular are going to exert a lot of political influence at every level of government. They actively push for policies that benefit them, and they're often very successful at winning over legislators. Um, this also goes for referenda. I think the rent control push in California that we just saw is pretty good evidence of how private equity lobbying to the public can be very effective because when you pull for rent control, it's actually very popular amongst people. Here's a story of someone that I know personally and worked with in writing a recent report. So this is Theo Ganthos. Theo is a tenant leader who's been fighting Alden Global Capital's rental affiliate Homes of America ever since they took over his park, which is called North Morris Estates Manufactured Housing Park in Michigan. After Homes of America purchased the park, according to Theo, they experienced a lot rent hike right away. Homes of America started charging more fees, and they had 14 pages of onerous rules with arbitrary enforcement. Theo and his wife were not able to move their home out of the park because it was too old and the move would be too expensive. And this is something that we see all the time. Private equity essentially has a captive class of tenants who may own the structure on the piece of land but are not able to go elsewhere because they just can't move the home for whatever reason. According to Theo, the park also quickly deteriorated. He alleges that the company left many homes vacant and rotting, that they failed to repair basic infrastructure. I saw a pretty gnarly picture of a crumbling road. And they also left the community pool and clubhouse that were kind of advertised as amenities in unusable condition for 2 years. Most importantly, the water also was not safe to drink at the park. If you're a water quality person or know a lot about manufactured housing, this is really common because they often have, I don't understand exactly how it works, but the owner is more responsible for maintaining the water system than sort of like your standard house. So the water at Theo's Park was coming out chocolate brown. It's that gross picture down the bottom. And the company allegedly has been just kind of shutting off the water to seemingly repair it, but with no notice really often. And it's been going on for a long time. So the water issues here actually led to a revocation of the park's license to operate. The state and township issued a court injunction to halt park operations, and when they continued to operate, it led to criminal charges against the company for operating without a license. It's worth noting that while this is awesome that this happened, this sort of legal intervention is really uncommon and is a result of Theo and other tenants' relentless advocacy. And that enforcement of housing laws is generally really scant for manufactured housing. So I think when I talk about policy, that's something that's important to note is like um, laws are not where they need to be, but also enforcement of the laws we already have is not always happening against private equity. Um, and so Homes of America also went through some kind of concerning accounting errors with Theo. According to him, he said, they sent me a demand for $1,900 for possession, saying that I was late 19 times, going back 2 years and missed 2 payments. I always send my rent by certified mail. We sent in a legal answer with proof. They fixed the ledger and said we have a $0 balance. So essentially, he says that they falsely retaliated against him for protesting rent hikes and conditions. Um, I can't confirm or deny like what the motivations were there, but the fact that there was such a huge error is really fishy, and this is something we hear a lot about this company and similar companies. And Theo's story is one, unfortunately, that we do hear over and over. Private equity is going to buy up the manufactured housing. They fail to make the repairs. They raise rent. They add bogus fees, and they commit a lot of shady behavior, even retaliating against residents. Oftentimes, these residents are going to be elderly or disabled. They're almost always poor. And in my opinion, private equity has no place in the manufactured housing space. This is another story of Rashida Harrison, who is a tenant of Progress Residential. An investigation from a couple of North Carolina newspapers found that the business model of Progress Residential and related companies is finely tuned to squeeze profit out of their homes, often to the detriment of renters, neighbors, and other would-be home buyers. So this is a series of articles that detailed some horror stories from tenants, including her. Um, According to her report, first the toilet downstairs began backing up, then upstairs. She and her 11-year-old daughter couldn't flush the toilets or turn on the faucets, and if they did, brown water would come out. At the advice of the company, she submitted a maintenance request. A crew then came out and determined that something was wrong with the sewer line, but said that they needed permission from the company before doing any further repairs. To quote Harrison, that's when everything went straight to hell. Tainted water began rising in the backyard, she said, as plumbing problems continued inside the house. Sewage creeped up high enough to ruin her grill, patio furniture, and some of her grandkids' toys that were out the back of the house. And she had pictures showing the mess. We were basically living in feces all around us, Harrison said. You could not go in the backyard. They kept giving me the runaround about when someone was going to come back out. Progress Residential did not fix the problem until she complained to the state attorney general. And just one second, I'm going to grab my laptop cord here. Pardon me. All right. So that's a harrowing story that I think speaks to a broader trend, right? Which is private equity has a lot of really negative impacts on racial equity. Let's start by talking about where they're investing. So amongst corporate landlords, different business types are going to have different spatial strategies. So investigations we've seen of single family rentals have found that REITs, real estate investment trusts, are going to target whiter and more affluent neighborhoods. Private equity firms, really, in the studies that we've seen of specific cities, target working class communities of color, especially Black communities. This has a lot of really long-ranging impacts that I think we don't know what they are yet, and they're hard to measure. But some things that we're concerned about are obviously the undermining of wealth building through home ownership, decreasing the availability of rental housing due to reduced maintenance, and also like that if you are able to get a home, the quality of it is really bad, and then there's all these kind of runaway negative health outcomes that can arise from that. Certainly the past story, you can imagine how that might work, the past couple of stories. They're also raising the rent, so further extracting wealth from working people. And we actually did a study in Minneapolis that found that one company had extracted millions and millions of dollars from people in one specific neighborhood in North Minneapolis. Another thing that's going to happen in terms of impacts is displacement and the term that we call root shock. So disruption of crucial place-based community networks that many people do depend on for not only survival, but also to thrive, which they deserve. It's also really important to note that housing interacts with the criminal punishment system in very direct ways. So eviction, displacement, and homelessness are very clearly linked to incarceration. Eviction can sort of start a downward spiral in someone's life that is very, very hard to get out of. And then it sort of goes the other way as well, right? So criminal records are going to limit your housing options, especially for private equity firms, which themselves are using really robust tenant screening services. There's even a recent pending lawsuit out of Indiana that is alleging that a couple of private equity firms were using involvement with the system of criminal punishment as a proxy for race, and thereby violating fair housing law. So it's really very serious, and that goes in both directions. And I think just one thing, when we talk about what's being stolen from BIPOC communities, it's also extremely vital that we just discuss who's benefiting from that redistribution and that theft. So the reality is that the people who profit the most from this organized theft are overwhelmingly white. Among the private equity C-suite, 72% are white and 3% are Black. And I think that that's shocking to me to hear. This here is a map that I made when I conducted a kind of informal study of private equity presence in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So these are the two counties. I think just the main thing to note, so areas with more percent Black Indigenous people of color are shown in black, and then private equity homes are shown in the greens and the blues on here. So you can kind of see in that sort of central chunk of North Minneapolis there is an incredible concentration of private equity investment. And this needs more statistical analysis to really say anything, but I do think it's a really striking visual that makes it very clear that they have specific investment strategies that are often based on demographics. And now I'm just going to talk about a couple of case studies here, in addition to the ones I've already spoken about, with just sort of how private equity works throughout the entire process. So Blackstone, you probably have heard of them. They're in the news pretty often. Blackstone is not the same as BlackRock. You'll often hear about that as sort of the corporate landlord boogeyman, but often people mean Blackstone. So Blackstone, the largest private equity company in the world with over $1 trillion in assets under management, raises money from pension funds and other investors. In 2012, Blackstone founded Invitation Homes and created a fund to buy foreclosed single-family homes and rent them out. Invitation Homes then bought 80,000 single-family homes to rent between 2012 and 2019. And then Blackstone increased the income by charging high fees and rents, and then reducing their expenses, like we were talking about, by skimping on maintenance and repairs. In 2017, Blackstone then took Invitation Homes public and sold off 25% of the company. Blackstone sold off the rest of the stake of the company in 2019. Blackstone made about $7 billion from its sale of Invitation Homes. They also, after we made this graphic, went through a really massive lawsuit and settlement. Or Blackstone didn't, but Invitation Homes did. Another example we're going to use is CIM Group. CIM is a Los Angeles-based private equity firm. They raise money from pension funds and other investors, like just sort of like we've been talking about. In 2020, CIM purchased Southern Towers, which is a 5-building apartment complex with over 2,000 units in Northern Virginia. They then ignored mold, pest, maintenance issues, and filed hundreds of eviction notices during a nationwide ban on evictions due to the COVID pandemic. Tenants felt that CIM wanted them out so that the company could charge higher rents to employees of Amazon, which just announced that it would be building its second headquarters a few miles away. And that's a pretty common playbook, excuse me. I'm going to quickly just walk through some myths that we frequently hear about private equity. There are many more, but these are just sort of some examples. So one thing we hear a lot is that private equity is a really central part of the economy and that it does a lot to create value for pension retirees, small businesses, etc. And our response to that is that private equity actually is creating economic conditions for everyone that make life more difficult unless you're very rich and more expensive for poor and middle income people. And it's also discouraging competition because it just tends towards consolidation in such a sort of extreme way. A second myth that we hear is that private equity is doing a lot. It's charitable by providing affordable housing. People are able to live in neighborhoods where they normally wouldn't be able to. We need someone to build the housing. In reality, private equity rarely is constructing new housing. When it does, it's typically luxury housing. There are some examples of where private equity is like managing or maybe even constructing affordable housing, but there's a lot of horror stories built into that too. The private equity business model is almost always going to lead to drastic rent increases. That's sort of just like how it works. In fact, it's really specifically attracted to what is called undervalued assets, so properties that have a lot of room to become more profitable. That's why they're buying in many cases. A third myth is that private equity is just a scapegoat and we're having a national housing supply crisis. Private equity only owns about 3% of rental housing in the US, and it's just really not a big deal. These are a bunch of left-wing loonies who are raving on about, the scapegoat, this boogeyman. And I think our response to that is that private equity, that 3% number really obscures a lot about how this operates. It obscures place, it obscures scale, it obscures local economies. So private equity landlords' outsized presence in certain states, cities, and neighborhoods is really impacting affordability and home ownership in those places. And again, like those impacts aren't evenly distributed. It falls along race and class lines very often. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a case where private equity was actually enabled by bad planning. I think this falls more on city elected officials than on planners themselves, but I think it's interesting and illustrative. I ended up cutting some stuff out of this section so we have more time to talk about policy interventions, but I'm really happy to talk more about this if anyone's interested in this issue. And if you have examples of how this happens in your own work, I would really love to hear about that because it's something I'm trying to research, but it's pretty hard to research without getting deep in some meeting minutes, which we don't all have time to do. All right, so this is the case study of the City of Atlanta's redevelopment of the Gulch Project, also known as Centennial Yards. Um, I'm going to lay out in detail how the current housing policy environment has created a sort of bonanza for private equity later in this presentation. In this section, I'm going to offer some examples of how planners and local elected officials sometimes enable private equity. And I'm focusing on the development process because that's where planning plays the biggest role and because I'm a nerd about it. So sorry in advance if you live in or love Atlanta as I do. So from the controversial Cop City project to the well-documented corporate takeover of the single-family rental market, Atlanta is really ground zero for the private equity takeover. Despite alarms being raised by advocates from across the city, officials have continued to form partnerships in Atlanta with private equity firms, falling for false promises of affordable housing and equitable development. The latest example of this is with the ongoing Gulch project, where City of Atlanta officials signed a deal with the LA-based private equity firm CIM Group to redevelop a 40-acre area of land in downtown Atlanta. And the idea behind this was kind of to balance out some of the development of the north end of town and create opportunities for economic growth, as well as like they're pretty explicit about catering to out-of-town visitors to the area, which I think is really interesting. So with initial estimates for this project being about $5 billion, the city offered CIM Group nearly $2 billion in sales and property tax abatements in exchange for promises of affordable housing, various public enhancement projects, and construction contracts that emphasize diversity and equity. The deal was really controversial at its inception in 2019, with 8 council members out of 15 voting yes. So that's almost an even split after over 9 hours of public comment. So while proponents of the deal argued that the deal could have a generational impact, CIM Group has a very clear documented history of mistreating tenants and gentrifying neighborhoods. They were the example I just gave you about Northern Virginia, displacing African immigrants for the Amazon tenants. They also have a track record of really seeking out public dollars in order to pad their profits. And there's a lot of really creative ways that they do that. So how did this happen? In short, the city basically shortchanged itself by neglecting to do due diligence regarding in lieu fees. So they have an ordinance that requires the cost per unit to be calculated yearly. But they actually were using construction cost numbers from 2017 to 2018, which was a completely different housing market. So when CIM pulled out of the deal and said, we actually are no longer going to provide on-site affordable housing, we're going to pay you instead, there's actually a gap of $3 million almost for how much it would actually cost to construct those units elsewhere. That just shouldn't happen. That should not have happened. And it's an example of where like I think this is something that planners, like if not directly involved in this process, like it's very kind of relevant because we're projecting what will be needed for the future, right? So more broadly, Atlanta has followed a really pro-development agenda that doesn't always think about potential impacts on poor and working people who really like need to be centered in this planning process. So to me, there are 2 really important lessons here. One is that you have to scrutinize the developer's track record during the project planning process. People who know a lot about land use law probably know that that is like not always permissible. But I think where it is possible, it's really crucial to do because I like this was really foreseeable, essentially, which is what this quote on the right is saying. It's also important to make sure that processes are in place that financially disincentivize private equity and other corporate landlords from backing out of affordable housing deals, and other promises for community benefits. So this way, the way that this played out, like financially incentivize them actually to back out, and working people lost out. Also, just want to talk quickly about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, just in terms of a way, it feels like a little bit of a jump, but this is another way that the government is sort of enabling some of this stuff. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you've probably heard of them. They're known as the government-sponsored enterprises or GSEs. So they are underwriting loans on mortgages for many properties in the U.S. with the goal of expanding housing availability by providing more liquidity to the market. Fannie and Freddie, since the 2008 crash, are overseen by the FHFA. It's really good that these entities exist. I am really pro GSEs. And it's good that they're overseen by the federal government. That is something that needed to happen. But right now, the federal government doesn't have a lot of standards for buildings that receive these GSE-backed loans, which is really a problem. So the following rules are going to go into effect in February after some tireless advocacy from tenants. So now there will be a requirement for a 30-day notice for rent increases, 30-day notices for lease term expirations, and minimum 5-day grace periods for late rent payments. And in a lot of geographies, these are already like municipally or under state law required. So it's just it's good that that happened, but they could be following a lot more rules, I think. So tenants are organizing around the country right now for more aggressive standards related to the following issues. So that's going to be habitability. Properties just need to be kept in safe and livable condition. They want the right to collectively bargain as tenant unions together, and they want rent stabilization. And that's really the big one, is that sometimes the way that these loans are structured, it makes it really difficult for landlords to not immediately go in and raise rent. And obviously, as I've said, private equity is going to look for opportunities to do that wherever they can. Another thing is, as it stands, the federal government doesn't have a good system to keep track of who gets these loans, so it's really hard to get a comprehensive view of how much PE is actually benefiting from what is real. This is a handout. So some statistics that we do have is that from ProPublica, we know that private equity firms were behind 85% of Freddie Mac's biggest apartment complex deals during the period where they were investigating. Private equity is now the dominant form of financial backing. Furthermore, among the 35 largest owners of multifamily buildings. Um, and then, according to some of our analysis on manufactured housing, and we have a really great manufactured housing tracker if that interests you, 49%, so about half of private equity owned manufactured housing parks received loans backed by Fannie or Freddie. Okay, so we have diagnosed the problem. We sure have. And so what do we do now? And the answer is that there's actually a lot that we can do. I think it's easy to get really stuck and feel kind of despondent about this, but I think both through organized tenant movements and through policy changes, there's a lot that can be done. Um, so I think housing is generally really poorly regulated in this country. I don't think that's news to anyone on this call. That's especially true in red states like the one where I live. And it's kind of just the case that the constitutional rights of property holders, which is what this whole country is structured around, get in the ways of the kinds of redistributed policies that would probably what are really needed to appropriately address the power that private equity firms do hold over tenants. It's also true it can be really difficult to get politicians to make moves that go against the status quo. But there are viable stopgaps and also moderate interventions that um, range like even all the way up to really transformative policies. Like there is potential for these things. So I just want to plug really quick. I've written this report called Tools for Tackling Corporate Landlords. It has 4 parts, and it is available at that link down at the bottom of this slide. We're going to have a part 4 come out really soon that will be a model policy menu for lawmakers, basically like outlaying for different levels of government what we think needs to be done in a very concise fashion. So the first thing we can do here is just getting some rental registries, licensing, and some proactive inspections working. So requiring landlords to be licensed and then collecting information on the properties that they own and proactively requiring that the cities are going to be routinely inspecting rental properties. This is like 3 kind of different bundles of policy that work really well together as kind of a system. So a landlord registry, if you haven't heard of one, is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a municipally or state maintained database. It would be great if we had a federal landlord registry, but you know, realistically, it's a municipally maintained list of building and ownership details that gets stored in one centralized database. So in order for cities to be able to truly understand and regulate their rental housing stock, we just have to have this information. It needs to be accessible to the public and it needs to be centralized. This is especially true given, like I said, it's really hard to determine who owns an actual property if all we have is an LLC owner. So simply just knowing what's going on is a big part of the battle here. That's true for a lot of things about private equity, but also just like getting an idea of what they own. And that's why this transparency is so powerful. Um, and but I think it's also like right now we are seeing some really good movement, including from the federal government, about trying to get that transparency. It's also just like not enough. It's kind of step zero. So you need some sort of enforcement mechanism as well, right? So this is where licensing comes in. If landlords have to get approval before they rent out their properties, that approval can also be denied or revoked in cases where landlords are, repeatedly failing to comply with habitability standards, or have other legal issues. So this is really important for private equity landlords because most of like I said, they have that very clear pattern of deferring maintenance as much as possible because they want to cut costs. Even in cases where repairs are really urgently needed, like if your backyard is filling up with sewage. Um, in addition, a city could theoretically also limit like the number of licenses that one entity is allowed to own, which would effectively really prevent that monopolization by limiting portfolios to a certain size, say like 50 homes. I've had a lot of state lawmakers who are really interested in this, and a lot of things have been tried. Um, this has successfully been used to regulate short-term rentals in the past, like a similar kind of legal logic in places like Atlanta and Wilmington, North Carolina. These regulations, unfortunately, do face a lot of legal challenges from higher courts over sort of like the idea that this is a taking, an unfair taking. But I still think they're really crucial. We have an instance where uh, for the case of Progress Residential, they went under a lawsuit from the Minnesota Attorney General. Like throughout that process, the city was kind of able to revoke some of those licenses, and it was really kind of like important towards getting a settlement for tenants and sort of ceasing some of that operation for a moment. Um, Successful licensing programs, they're like the money doesn't just come from nowhere, so they would require landlords to pay a small fee for each property they're going to rent out. Um, and you could use that to fund the administration of licensing and pay for inspectors, or you could use it to support other affordable housing efforts like a land trust or a land bank. Um, so in the US, this type of policy, like both registries and licensing are going to be really uncommon, which is kind of odd if you actually like step back and think about it, because safety standards and information gathering are seen by a lot of people as a pretty like uncontroversial core function of government. And some states even ban landlord registries outright, including mine. Okay, so in an ideal world, the most direct way to combat the issue of corporate consolidation is going to be to straight up place caps on how many properties a given business entity can own. Like you have enough, you don't need more. These should be for people to live in. But so far, most case law has decided that it's not constitutional to block a corporation or a person from either buying or owning a property. So the way that we get around this, and it's like pretty in line with some of the stuff I was talking about in the last slide, is not to ban large portfolios altogether, but to place limits on the acquisition of those properties beyond a certain threshold in order to make amassing a huge amount of real estate kind of like less profitable. And if something's not profitable, again, it's not attractive for corporate landlords. So you can own it, but you can't make heaps of money off of it. We've already talked about, for example, how some jurisdictions could refuse to grant rental licenses beyond a certain number of properties. And there's some really exciting bills that have been introduced in lines with these ideas. I think just for the sake of time, I'm not going to get deeply into them, but North Carolina had one that would cap the number of homes at 100 for North Carolina's most populous counties, and then would institute um, fines for basically if that was not met. That's the only state level bill of this kind to my knowledge. There's also been a bunch of I think maybe some have been introduced actually since I made this presentation, sorry. Um, there have also been some federal movements along these lines. So in July of 2022 and then reintroduced last year, there was a proposed kind of like bill that would levy a real estate transfer tax equal to the property's sale price for any large firm buying a single family home. And then There was also another bill that would charge firms $20,000 for any properties acquired over 100, and then also require firms to sell off 10% of their portfolio per year until they can meet the 100 home limit. None of these things have made it very far, but I think an interesting thing that has happened in the past few months, I think since Vice President Harris started discussing corporate landlords a lot, was that we had a lot of legislatures who were willing to kind of we're starting to look into reintroducing some of these things. So it's possible that we'll see a lot of state level momentum on this front in the next couple of years. I also want to mention a couple of bills that have come up in Ohio, which is interesting because they're from a Republican representative. We don't usually see that, but it's not unheard of either. Um, he introduced several bills aimed at combating corporate landlords. One would require investors to wait 45 days before they're allowed to bid on a foreclosed home. A similar bill would ban corporate landlords from bidding on foreclosed homes if they have unpaid fines or open code violations, which is really important because sometimes they just buy these homes that have a lot of problems and then never fix them up. And there was another one as well that the Ohio Senate would levy a $1,500 tax on mega home investors in the state per home. Obviously, these things are not popular with landlords at any level, but it's a visionary mode for addressing what is a new and emerging problem that we don't really have the legal infrastructure to deal with right now. So I do expect that there will be more of this. I'm going to breeze through this slide since you probably are already really aware of land trusts and land banks and what they do. But this is another thing that we kind of propose. In the meantime, I think obviously the goal is to get some sort of social housing so that people are guaranteed and provided like a public housing source if they need access to it. But in the meantime, we have these like established great entities that sometimes work pretty well called land trusts and land banks. So land trusts are going to be, you're trying to create a permanently affordable housing supply, and you're either renting to low-income people or selling to first-time working class homeowners at affordable prices. Land banks, those are going to be more for forfeited or abandoned homes or lots, often sold at a really low price. Sometimes with the promise that the new owner will restore or maintain the property. Sometimes these also go to investors, which shouldn't be happening. That needs to be addressed. But these can also be a way for the community to get land or properties that are usable and relatively affordable. A really well-funded land trust system, I think, is a great way to remove housing from the speculative market and just get it to its purpose of providing shelter. They do need a lot of houses to meet this demand. So again, that would have to be funded, I think, ideally by a tax on landlords. Yeah, and ideally this would all be handled by a local public housing administration, but there's a lot of bureaucratic reasons and otherwise why land banks might be an easier option to pursue in the short term. We also have the tenant opportunity to purchase, also known as the right of first refusal, as a really important policy means for combating corporate landlords that we actually have seen be used several times. So this is a legal arrangement that allows one party to participate in a business deal before others are allowed to do so. So in housing, TOPA is typically discussed regarding the rights of tenants to purchase the homes they live in when the homes go up for sale. Other right of first refusal policies have also been used to grant similar priority to local governments and nonprofits already. Like those things are in motion. So these policies are a really important piece of the movement to combat the corporate landlord takeover. It's really important, especially for manufactured housing, per the example on the right. Many parks have been bought up and then they get really drastic increases in lot rent. If people have the opportunity to own them cooperatively, they just spend the cost that it takes to maintain the property and have much more control over their housing. And it effectively eliminates a lot of that price gouging. So Colorado's got some great laws on the books that could be a model for other states in this regard. Also, we can't have this conversation without talking about tenant protections. There are tons of tenant protections that need beefing up in this country. But I think two really important ones for corporate landlords in particular are just cause and tenant right to counsel. And one thing I'll say is like these have the end goal of protecting tenants. They also are an amazing way to deter speculators, right? So we actually see this when they make filings with the SEC for the companies that are required to do that, the publicly traded corporate landlords. They list regulation as a financial risk. They're not as attracted to markets that have a lot of regulations. Like, it's part of the reason why they're all over the Southeast, among other things. So it's really not a mistake that corporate landlords are really active in those places, and having these types of things can kind of keep them out. So first, we've got just cause. Just cause eviction protections are designed to prevent arbitrary, retaliatory, or discriminatory evictions by establishing that landlords can only evict renters for very specific reasons, such as failure to pay rent or like ongoing criminal activity. Um, and although just cause eviction legislation differs depending on the state or the locality, the core elements are going to be crafting like a really specific definition of what is legal grounds for eviction, so landlords can't just kind of come up with something, placing limits on rent increases, and then enhancing written notice requirements so people know they're going to be evicted and can prepare. Oftentimes people get pretty short notice, and that's not a lot of time to be able to move all their stuff and find a new place to live. The other thing we want is tenant right to counsel. So while the US Constitution guarantees the right to legal counsel for criminal cases, it's not true for civil cases, including eviction. So people are often representing themselves if they even know to show up at all. And we've seen that having a lawyer makes a huge difference in your case outcome and therefore the trajectory of your life. So we think that this is something everyone should have. And so yeah, it's really just stabilizing households that face a lot of vulnerabilities that come with evictions. And state and local governments can choose to provide their citizens with such protection. All right, this is going to be my final slide. Thank you so much for sticking with me today. So I'm sure many of you are already thinking about rent control in one way or another. It's obviously a controversial topic. I'm a huge proponent because of its ability to keep people housed. It's ensuring that their housing costs stay relatively affordable. This is absolutely necessary, especially for private equity landlords, where we've seen cases where they're raising rent 50 or 100% between leases. That's extreme, but it does happen. Again, similar to the things I was just talking about, rent control itself is also a really powerful anti-speculative device. So private equity firms cannot rapidly increase a property's revenue by raising rent. They're actually going to be less likely to pursue that jurisdiction as a site for their wealth extraction. That doesn't mean that they won't, but it means that maybe they'll go elsewhere first. I do like, because of that, it would be great to have some federal rent stabilization coming down the pike. I don't think that that will be happening in the next 4 years, but that would be wonderful. And then in the few places where rent control already exists, it needs to be strengthened because there are a lot of loopholes. And then sort of the other side as well is that other states do have laws on the books that are explicitly preempting rent control. So there've been a lot of states in the past few years that have had those preemptions challenged, and I anticipate that in general we're going to see a move towards challenging a lot of things on a housing preemption front. But I think that will continue with rent control, especially. And so while I've named a lot of other helpful policy tools, I think rent control is probably the best at getting to the root cause of the tenancy crisis, which is that housing is treated as a speculative asset, and the value of it is very divorced from the actual cost of housing provision. There's also a really large push to get some form of rent control, as I mentioned, at properties that have federally backed loans. Right now, that protection doesn't exist, but it would be great to deliver that affordability in line with the mission of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I also just want to talk really quickly about price fixing software, and then I'll wrap up. Many cities are currently working to ban price fixing software. There are also several cases moving through the courts right now against the company RealPage. That's Department of Justice, as well as several states. RealPage is owned by the private equity firm Thoma Bravo. The suit alleges that the company RealPage formed an illegal cartel of corporate landlords by sharing non-public information that then allowed them to fix rent prices for what is dozens or hundreds of thousands, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, of apartment units across the country. Again, with really specifically concentrated in certain markets. So many cities, and I believe a couple of states, are explicitly trying to make this illegal. Many people, I think, claim that rent control reduces supply by discouraging landlords from building new housing. I think the evidence is a bit mixed on this. I know there was a recent study from the Urban Institute found that kind of the impact depends on what level of affordability you're talking about for the housing, but for housing that's considered deeply affordable, which is what benefits the very poorest people, it did succeed in maintaining stabilizing rent, so and supply. So I think given the scope of this problem and the fact that homelessness literally kills people, we need to do some really big thinking about what type of interventions we're willing to do. Like I said before as well, rent control is really popular and polls really well. Um, so with that, I conclude our presentation. We've talked about a lot of information today, and I talked really fast, so thank you for listening. And I've still barely scratched the surface. So if you're curious about something I discussed today, I'm happy to connect you to resources or speak with you further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mad. You are a tough person to keep up with, that's for sure. We do have some questions in the Q&A. Given that we have 20 minutes left, I'll go through these relatively fast. Would you be able to share any data on how this has been distributed regionally?
Off the top of my head, I am not able to do so. I think private equity investment is really attracted, like I said, to the Sun Belt or the Southeast. I'd be happy to dig up some more stuff and send that to Christine as well for distribution.
All right. Are there any good tools or resources that are available to help identify when properties are owned by private equity or what housing is owned by private equity? I know you had kind of touched on that there's a lack of transparency and a lack of data on that, but is there anything that exists?
Yes, and I remembered one thing that I need to plug for the last question. I apologize. We do have a private equity risk index that takes housing into account. So you're able to see that includes recent acquisitions of housing by corporate investors, large investors. So that's one place you can look is Google Private Equity Risk Index. And back to your question, I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
Sure. Good tools or resources for cities to use to see what housing is owned by private equity or identify properties owned by private equity companies.
Yes, this does not exist. It really should. We have put together a list. We have, like I mentioned in the presentation, a private equity manufactured housing tracker. So we do have this for manufactured housing. We were planning this year to launch one for multifamily housing, but because of some data sharing issues with the company where we get our data from, unfortunately, are not able to publicize that outside of the aggregate. I think there are some like local journalists who've done a lot of investigations for a few jurisdictions, but there's no sort of like comprehensive resource that takes a look at private equity owned housing as a whole. I wish there was.
Sounds like a good 60 minutes episode, if you ask me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so Kirby asked, basically, they've heard of an individual housing court who wouldn't allow anyone to be evicted unless they met registration, inspection, and local agent requirements. Is this a legitimate approach, and how can it be codified?
I've never heard of that. I think, yeah, I'm really curious to hear more about that to really be able to weigh in. I think, I mean, I used to have a job that was entirely just processing eviction data for Durham County, and one thing that I found all the time, in addition to just tears and sadness, was that landlords were just not properly like even filing the evictions, like they would put the wrong name on it. So there's just that administrative part, and then there's also like they very often I assume are not registering correctly with the Secretary of State. I think that's what this is referring to. Um, and yeah, that's a huge problem as well. I think any angle you can take to get to prevent people from getting evicted, and I mean any angle, is a good angle.
Okay. Nick Christie asked, is it possible to get a list of where any of these policies have been tried? And I am assuming Nick, that you're referring to the registry licensing inspections?
The report series that I linked does include, it's not comprehensive, but it includes cases and examples from several geographies. Um, and also, if you're interested in that, send me an email because I believe that we just got access to a new database that tracks these things. And I'd be happy to forward you the report that came out of it. I'm forgetting the name of it, unfortunately.
All right, well, it looks like Nick may have given you a thumbs up.
Okay, good.
Nick also asked, when it comes to imposing any kind of cap on the number of properties via a tax, et cetera, a private equity entity can own, how do you get around the fact that they can just set up multiple LLCs and buy up properties within that cap, but all under the same private equity umbrella?
Yes, this is a super good question, and I apologize. The LLC thing is so complicated, and I tried to kind of explain it as briefly as I could, but let me just do it again. Um, so right now, we don't have any system for tracking who owns LLCs. That's a lot of sort of guesswork and piecing together on my end, pretty much. So, kind of step zero of being able to do any of that kind of enforcement is to establish a transparency system where we have what is called a beneficial ownership database. So we say, this is the LLC, and this is who is in charge of the LLC. So we're just able to get a look at that. And then the other side of that, once you have that information, is to impose steep enough fines, or in some cases, I've seen bills that have criminal charges built into it for people who are intentionally skirting around this. So the enforcement component is as important as the knowledge base, basically.
Excellent. Okay, next question is from a fellow Illinois planner, my friend Karen Bricks. She says a lot of these program ideas suggested depend on local municipalities to implement. However, these types of programs would likely require staffing increases and other costs that a municipality may not be able to cover. The way a city would often mitigate the cost impact would be through fees, which then may be passed on to tenants. Have you considered how to implement these ideas in an equitable manner while considering a local government's financial constraints?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it is not one that I have a pithy, snappy answer to. I think this is like the thing about a lot of the changes that need to be made, unfortunately, do require more funds than we often have. Um, I think, yeah, the example I used was, you know, requiring landlords to register and then pay a small fee to administer, um, like a type of investigation or inspection unit. But I hear that about it being passed on to tenants, and I think there's probably like a lot of interesting ways you could do that. But my answer to that is rent control and banning the fees and the fines. And yeah, that's not a perfect answer. I wish I had a better one. I would love to hear from y'all if you have them.
All right. Kirby asked, what methods do you use to attempt to identify patterns in parcel-based LLCs as covers for larger private equity firms?
Sorry, I keep telling you to send me an email. I have an entire presentation about this that I would love to link to you that it's made for tenants and it outlines the methods in great detail. In short, we're typically going into the parcel data, um, taking a look at who owns the most properties, or like, let me back up. Basically, we use the addresses that they are registered to, and then link them together by searching by address. And that involves also having to kind of like go online to Secretary of State records and then see the connection there. Like it's very, very backwards. Kirby, go ahead.
Um, what do you need to know from me? I'm not clear. Do you want me just to explain what my question was?
Do you need to ask any additional questions or get any additional?
About this? No, we just try to do this as part of our housing analysis of communities, is to do an Excel match to see how the addresses compare the property address compares to out-of-state addresses, but then it's really hard to see how, you'll have a whole list of small single property LLCs, and it's hard to tell whether all of those aren't really fronts for some single larger company. So that's what I was curious about.
Yeah, so in that case, that's where you would check out the mailing address field in the parcel data, and it's typically always going to be going in the same place. Sometimes there are some variations in spelling that can be um, cleaned up if you have anybody who kind of knows how to code or do fuzzy matching. Um, and also, I've seen a lot of people do a lot of interesting stuff with GIS in this realm and sort of I wanted to say geocaching, geocoding the data and you doing spatial matching that way to sort of try and see like where are they linking back to. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but the address matching is the main thing.
Okay. Tia, would you like to unmute and ask your question that you put in the chat?
Yeah, well, I don't think it was a question, but I think I'm trying to bring my video back. It wasn't a question. I was just wondering, like, are there, like, where does homelessness play into this? Like, is there any area of overlap? I think I put another comment in the chat. No. Oh, it will be interesting to know the number of units owned by private equity firms that are occupied versus not being occupied. Like the house I'm driving by is empty. It's been empty. I knew a family used to live there, but now they don't. And who owns it? That was it. No real question.
Yeah, so responding to the two of those, homelessness study is kind of like its entire world of expertise that I'm not going to pretend to know a lot about. I think it's also really hard to tease out, like I said, the downstream and wider impacts of private equity investment because there's so many confounding factors. Um, I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say that when the rent gets more expensive, that's not good for homelessness. And generally, that's what's going to happen here. Um, and your second question, jog my memory, I'm so sorry.
Being occupied versus not occupied.
Yeah. I don't know that we have that available unless you pay for a proprietary database like Yardi. Um, but that's something that I'm really interested in as well. I don't know how much y'all have heard about Durham, North Carolina, but we've basically been on this really tremendous building kick, including some multifamily buildings constructed by private equity or like really large corporate landlords. And um, there's a strong suspicion by a lot of people from anecdotes that um, they're very vacant and that we kind of like put a lot of, stake into increasing supply, but it's so expensive that nobody actually lives in it. So I'm going to be doing a little investigation in my local city to kind of see how that bears out. But it's a good question. It's one of those things where um, the data asymmetry in the real estate world is really wild. What's useful for government and for the people and what's useful for investors are um, sometimes there's overlap, but what's available for us is really not good. We're in the dark ages.
All right, I'm going to give Nick a chance to talk. He had one question.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, part Tia's question actually, which was similar to that. I'm in business licensing for the city of Las Vegas, and so we're kind of exploring different like feasibility and pathways on how we might be able to impose some kind of like a business license on corporate landlords and so on. But as Tia was just kind of talking about, one of the things that we could do because we have done it for other types of business licenses is to have them report to us certain bits of data. We can have them report to us whatever we kind of want them to. So if we were to do some kind of licensing and say, hey, you need to tell us on a, I don't know, quarterly, annual basis or whatever it may be, if this property is occupied or not. I guess I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if anyone here is a lawyer, but I wonder if that would be legally challenged as perhaps, I don't know, do you think that might be, would that be worth exploring, or is that kind of will probably get shut down?
I think it's absolutely worth exploring. That's a really creative idea that I hadn't totally considered. We had been sort of we're talking with the Washington Secretary of State office right now about sort of getting something similar through that structure. Um, it's just really going to depend on your state legislative environment and what preemption is going on. I know here where I live, there's a statute that just says like you cannot collect any information on landlords, which is really wild to me. Um, so it's possible that you're in that kind of situation, but I also it's like again, um, that's not a crazy thing to ask. Like it's not weird that the government would want to know that. So I think it's certainly reasonable and it's a great idea.
Great, thank you. I'm going to be sending you an email with lots of requests for more data because I need data. Thank you.
Yeah, I really encourage anybody who has questions or wants more to shoot me an email. There's I keep referring to external sources because I already talked so fast for so long. All right, I'll pass.
Yeah, Matt, would you mind putting your email in the chat as well?
Yes, of course.
And then I just gave Justin permission to talk because he had a question. And I think Justin will be the last question because we're 5 minutes out from the end of the webcast.
Okay. Hi, I'm in Cleveland. I just wanted to share about the ordinance was passed this year. They're changing like the rental registry system. So they're adding a vacant property registry. So basically anything that's not owner occupied needs to be registered with a local agent in charge. So if the owner is not located in the county, they need to put someone like who is responsible legally for that property designated on the certificate of disclosure when it's sold. So we'll see how that plays out as it just passed. So we'll start to see those registries come through this year. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But the other thing about the ordinance, I think, is going to be they're with these vacant properties, they're adding in an inspection component if your property is selling vacant, like without being occupied. So it's kind of interesting. Well, good thing to keep an eye on as it goes and see how that works out.
Ohio at it again.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more question. Kirby, go ahead.
Hi there. I just wanted to clarify my earlier question about the housing court. I was actually talking about the PE firms. The problem is if you put a rental registry in place, that's great. But what if that obscure LLC that no one can figure out who they are just decides not to register, right? How do you enforce that? And I was talking with a fellow planner about that, and they said, and I don't have the specific place, but they said that they knew of a housing court judge who basically said, oh, you haven't met this requirement, you haven't registered, you haven't been inspected, you haven't improved your maintenance to meet the inspection requirements, you can't evict this person. You're not up to code. So out, go, I won't talk to you. And I was curious if you'd run into that. It sounds like an excellent way to help enforce this, but it is one individual judge who decided to do this. So I'm curious how you think that might be taken further, if you think it's even a legitimate approach. Thank you.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you for telling me about that. I don't have the legal expertise to say whether or not that's legitimate. In my experience, being in many people's eviction court cases, the judges treat the eviction as a completely separate legal matter from everything else that might be going on. Particularly, I'm thinking of habitability. So I'm not sure if that's legally sound or not. I will say there might be something about like the mechanism of like, well, we don't know who you are, and we don't know if you have the legal right to be bringing this before the court, actually, because you haven't completed this administrative step. That could be why it's passable. I don't really know. That's certainly not a widespread practice, but it's a good one. I mean, I I think there are many things that we could require of landlords before they're allowed to evict people. And I think that's a great example.
I think that's also a great thing to end on, because that overall, whether or not it's private equity or not, like housing is important. And yeah, having some guardrails on evictions would be phenomenal. So we are closing in on 1:30. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This was a extremely informative conversation, at least for me it was. Please be sure to log in your CM credits at planning.org and make sure to check the Ohio Planning website. That's ohioplanning.org/planning webcasts for upcoming webcasts. I want to give a special shout out to the upcoming Illinois webcast, and that is the law session on December 20th. We have some of our star attorneys back for another year of law updates. And then finally, I want to just thank Mad and Tia for this fantastic session today. So thank you.
Yes, thanks everyone for participating. We appreciate it. Thank you, Matt.
Janelle, did you have a question? I see your hand was up.
Can't seem to unmute. Oh, there I am. I didn't get the contact information from Ed.
Sure, it was in the chat.
I didn't see it.
Okay, I'm gonna put it in there right now. Do you see it now?
I see it. Thank you.
Very good. You are welcome. All right. Matt, I have to ask,